Okay, we are back again here. This should be part 11 here, and we are going to talk about the book of James to begin with. You know, when we look at these 9 Hebrew Christian epistles, we see that they are all dealing with the subject of faith. In the book of Hebrews, it presented the superiority of Jesus Christ, which is the object of our faith. And so now we're going to look at the book of James and its emphasis on works. And we are going to see in the book of James that works are produced by genuine faith itself. When we go on to the book of First Peter, we'll see that First Peter deals with living a life full of grace, which is produced by a life of faith. On in Second Peter, we're going to see that it emphasizes adding to our faith all the other parts or the other aspects of a believer's walk with God. So once again, Hebrews, it presented the superiority of Jesus Christ, who is the object of our faith. The book of James, we see that the works are produced by genuine faith. First Peter, we live a life full of grace, which is produced by a life of faith. Second Peter, adding to our faith everything else that is needed for a believer's walk with God. So from there, we'll go on. First John emphasizes walking by faith in fellowship. Second and Third John of Jude emphasizes contending for the faith. And Revelation, also written by John, finishes up the New Testament with the believer's hope and the hope of our faith. And if you remember, that word hope means an assurance. So the book of Revelation is about the assurance of our faith. So James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as well as Jude, they used to be called the general or universal epistles by the early church. But for the most part, their intended audiences were believers in general rather than individuals or churches, as was the case with Paul's epistles. For example, James addresses his epistle to the 12 tribes which were scattered abroad. Each of these epistles bear the uniqueness of each individual writer, yet through them all, we can see the hand of God is directing and overseeing the writing of this, his. So let's start with the book of James. There are 4 men mentioned in the New Testament who were called James. There is the Apostle James, the son of Zebedee, who along with his brother John were named the sons of thunder by Jesus. And that is seen in the book of Mark, chapter 3, verse 17. Then there is James the Less, who is mentioned in Mark chapter 15, verse 40, and he's believed to be the Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus. Luke chapter 6, verse 16 mentions James, the brother of the Apostle Judas, who is called Lebbaeus in Matthew chapter 10, verse 3. This is not Judas Iscariot, though. And the 4th James that is mentioned was the half-brother of Jesus. Little is known about James, the son of Alphaeus. James, the son of Zebedee, we know was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, but he was martyred early in Christian church history, and we read about that in Acts chapter 12, verse 2. And so that was probably around AD 40 to AD 42, somewhere in there. So he was most likely not the author of the book of James. So that leaves James, the half-brother of Jesus, as the James who wrote this epistle. This is also supported by early church tradition. James chapter 1, verse 1 records his name, and it says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. He wrote to the 12 tribes of Israel that were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. This immediately established his Jewish roots. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 6, it records this. It says, Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joses, and of Judah and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? In Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 and 56, it says pretty close to the same thing here. According to these passages, Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 to 50, it says that Mary and the brothers of Jesus were together and came to talk with him. When you compare these 3 passages, they seem to show close ties among the family members of Jesus. Being the brother of Jesus, James would have been brought up in the same environment as Jesus and would have been close to him in the years leading up to his ministry. During the years of Jesus' ministry, it appears that James and his brothers and sisters, they seem to have been unbelievers. They would have most certainly been very devout Jews, and they would have obeyed all of the Jewish festivals and sacrifices, but they did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God until after his resurrection. Now, after the resurrection, Mary and the brothers of Jesus were in the upper room when the new apostle was chosen, and were also there on the day of Pentecost, as we can see in Acts chapters 1 and chapter 2. James later became the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, and he acted as sort of the master of ceremonies at the Jerusalem council that is mentioned in Acts chapter 15. Josephus, who was an early Jewish historian, recorded that James was martyred in Jerusalem probably around the year AD 62. James became the leader of the elders in the Jerusalem church and was the main spokesman at the Jerusalem Council, which took place around AD 49. And we see that, as we say, in Acts chapter 15. The fact that James made no mention of this council or the decisions made would indicate that the book was probably written prior to AD 49. The early church was mostly Jewish for many years after the day of Pentecost. That's in Acts chapter 2. And the well-defined Christian terminology that can be found in Paul's writing is not seen in James. In James, we find very practical day-to-day principles for Christian living and the demonstration of one's faith through works. These factors would indicate that James may have been the earliest New Testament book written sometime between AD 40 and AD 48. The general date given by many scholars is around AD 45, and it would have been written from Jerusalem if that was the case. So, who was the book of James written to? In James 1:1, it has James saying, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. This salutation or greeting in verse 2 starts with, my brethren, which is showing that the scattered Jews that they're addressing were believers. They were brothers and sisters in Christ. You know, on the day of Pentecost, it says 3,000 were saved, as we see in Acts chapter 2, verse 41. And shortly thereafter, about 5,000 men believed and were added to the church in Acts chapter 4, verse 4. In Acts chapter 5, verse 14, it says that multitudes of men and women were being added to the church. I think it's interesting here that the priests and the religious leaders became quite concerned because so many of the Jews were becoming followers of Christ. Another interesting thing that I've always been very interested in is, as I say here, on the day of Pentecost, it says that 3,000 people were saved. Now, it's interesting that back in the book of Exodus, when Moses brought the law and presented it to the people, there was a real problem. They had made a golden calf and were worshiping it. And anyway, many people were killed because of their idolatry. Would you care to guess how many were killed? 3,000. 3,000 were killed when the law was presented, and 3,000 were saved by grace in Acts. That's not a coincidence. Anyway, it says there was even a great company of the priests who became believers, as we see in Acts chapter 6, verse 7, which was actually threatening to the existence of Judaism. And as a result, the priests and the religious leaders, it says they became stirred up. And it tells us that in Acts chapter 6:12, and they became stirred up against the church, and so persecution sets in. After the stoning of Stephen, believers were scattered abroad, it says, and that is seen in Acts chapter 8, verses 4. And these believers are spread out all across the Roman Empire. Additionally, at Pentecost and the three major Jewish feasts, Jews from around the Roman Empire came to Jerusalem to fulfill their religious obligations. Many of these Jews were converted at Pentecost, and many undoubtedly stayed for a time in that newly formed church group. Most of them would have traveled back to their own homes when persecution began. James addressed his epistle to the scattered Jewish believers around the Roman Empire who were going through persecution. The Jewish believers being addressed were going through a tremendous amount of persecution. This is indicated by the very first point that James makes here. And he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into diverse or various temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." We see that in James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. The scattering of these believers and their trials is a helpful indicator that this book was written very early in the Christian church. In chapter 5, James mentions the trials that they were experiencing, and he encourages them to be patient through them. False prophets had infiltrated the church, and James sought to correct the errors that they were promoting. James was concerned about practical Christianity, and the key verse emphasizes this, and that verse would be James chapter 1, verse 22. And it says, "But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves." You know, there seems to be about three different reasons or purposes for James writing the book of James. The first one, I believe, was to encourage them to be steadfast and patient in light of their persecution. Second reason would be to correct certain false teachings that were infiltrating the church. The third was to challenge these believers to demonstrate their faith by practical works. The Epistle of James is a very strong, but yet very small and compact letter on practical day-to-day religion. For James, the real acid test, I think, of true religion is in the doing of it rather than in the just the hearing of it. James was all about genuineness of faith, and it was very quick to encourage the lowly and encourage them that God gives grace to the humble, as seen in chapter 4, verse 6. Wisdom to the ignorant in verse 5 of chapter 1. Salvation to the sinner in verse 21 in chapter 1. And the kingdom to the poor in chapter 2, verse 5. He is also equally quick to condemn counterfeit religions that would they would substitute theory instead of actual practice, an actual practical application of faith. They're trying to give theory instead. And he does so very strongly there. And I think he has kind of a biting satire while doing so. You know, the thing is, true religion is moral religion, and it is social religion. True religion is doing the right thing in one's everyday life. And in this aspect, James echoes very clearly the ethical teaching of Jesus, especially as it is recorded in the Sermon on the Mount, which is found in Matthew's chapter 5, 5 through 7. A lot of kind of comparisons you can see between in the book of James and the Sermon on the Mount. Some Bible scholars suggest that James and Paul differ in their views on the saving significance of faith and works. Paul said this. He said, "A man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law." And you've seen that in Romans chapter 3, verse 28. And then James said, "A man is justified by works and not by faith alone." And we see that in James chapter 2, verse 19. A closer reading of these two thoughts, though, reveals that they differ more in their definition of faith than in the actual essence of this thing here. James writes to readers who are inclined to interpret faith as mere intellectual acknowledgement. As a consequence, he stresses that a faith that does not affect your life is not a saving faith. So his emphasis is on works. Actually, this is quite close to Paul's understanding. For Paul, faith is the entrusting of one's whole life to life to God through Christ. Anyway, as I was saying here, now for Paul, faith is the entrusting of one's whole life to God through Christ, with the result being that one's life becomes renewed with the fruits of the Spirit, which you find in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. So an outline for the book of James would be, number one, the test of faith is first seen in chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And that's broken down into a couple different parts here. Part A is the purpose of tests. And that's in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And then part B is the source. Where these temptations come from? And that's in verses 13 through 18. The second part is the characteristics of faith. And that's in chapter 1, verses 19 through chapter 5, verse 6. Made up of part A, faith obeys the word. verses 19 through 27 in chapter 1. Part B, faith removes discriminations, chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Third part, C, faith proves itself by works, chapter wisdom, chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Part F, faith produces humility, chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Part G, faith produces dependence on God, chapter 4, verses 13 through chapter 5, verse 6. The third part here is the triumph of faith, chapter 5, verses 17 through 12. Part B, faith prays for the afflicted, verses 13 through 18. And part C, faith confronts the erring believer, verses 19 and 20 here. And as I had said, our memory verse to learn for the book of James is James chapter 1, verse 22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. James chapter 1, verse 22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. All right. So let's move on here to the book of 1 Peter. The main theme of 1 Peter is the grace of God in the believer's life. The addressed in this letter were going through tremendous persecution, and they were in need of God's grace to overcome the adversity and to be able to stand firm in the Lord. The church began in Jerusalem and had roots in Judaism and in the Old Testament, in the law. From the very start of the church, believers were being persecuted. You know, in the book of Acts, Peter and John were put in prison repeatedly for preaching the gospel. As the number of believers grew rapidly, persecution by religious and political leaders as well was becoming more intense. Because of the persecution, believers were, as it says, scattered abroad, and it says they went everywhere preaching the word. You see that in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, the Lord had instructed believers to begin spreading the gospel in Jerusalem and then go to all Judea and then Samaria and then the uttermost parts of. However, immediately following the founding of the church, believers stayed in and around Jerusalem. It took persecution by unbelievers to force them to take the gospel message to the rest of the world. Evidently, a large group of Jews had gone to Asia Minor, and these were the recipients of the book of 1 Peter. Peter's message to them was that God's grace was sufficient to meet their needs wherever they were, regardless of their circumstances. And guess what? It still applies today. God's grace is sufficient for you and for I, for all of our needs, regardless of our situation. So, like Paul in all of his epistles, Peter began both of his epistles with his name. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ in 1 Peter 1:1. And Paul was the apostle to the non-circumcision. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. And Peter was the apostle to the circumcision, as it says, to the Jews. As John the Baptist preached by the Sea of Galilee, when he did that, he had many disciples were with him of his. And two of these disciples, when they heard Jesus, they left John and he brought a stone. You see that in John chapter 1, verse 42. Jesus did not, he was a fisherman, but he called an ignorant men. And we see that in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. Peter had been a fisherman. He was married, and he owned property. He had a boat. We know that. In this epistle, Peter did not identify himself as Simon, the son of Jonah, Simon Peter the fisherman, or Peter the disciple. None of those. He is Peter. His conversion name given to him by Jesus. He is an apostle, relating to his commission given to him by Jesus Christ. He is not the apostle, but he says that he is an apostle. He was Jesus Christ. Peter became one of the leading spokesmen for Jesus' disciples. Peter was part of that inner circle of disciples, which included Peter, James, and John. Peter often acted first and thought about it later. He was impulsive, yet he was indecisive on a lot of occasions as well. Peter denied the Lord 3 times, and then he repented of that, and it says he wept bitterly. And from the writing of it, I mean, you can feel that the intensity of his sorrow for having denied the Lord. God chose Peter to on the day of Pentecost, and we see that in Acts chapter 2. The internal evidence that is found in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 shows Peter to be the writer of the epistle. External evidence can be found in Galatians, where Paul wrote that Peter was the apostle to the Jews. What Paul wrote does not prove that Peter wrote this epistle, but it supports Peter's message to the Jews. The style of writing in the message in its contents are similar to Peter's preaching in Acts chapter 2 and other passages in Acts. Peter preached the first message of the church on the day of Pentecost, as we see in Acts 2, somewhere around AD 33. And over the next 10 to 20 years, the church was scattered all over the Roman Empire, especially after the Apostle James was martyred in about AD 42. Peter may have left Jerusalem, perhaps for Babylon. Peter wrote from, as he said, the church that is Babylon. Babylon was in Mesopotamia, and that's modern-day Iraq. We're all familiar with that, on the Euphrates River. When the Jews returned from exile in Babylon, only a small contingent of Jews actually returned. The vast majority remained in Babylon, and by New Testament times, there remained a large Jewish colony there in Babylon. It would therefore make sense that Peter went to Babylon and that he would have written this epistle from that church there in Babylon. Accompanying Peter there were Silvanus, or Silas, who had been with and helped Paul on his missionary tours, and Marcus, who was the writer of the Gospel of Mark, John Mark, as we call him. The exact dating of this epistle is uncertain, like so many of them, but most place this epistle being written about AD 63 here. His second epistle was written just a few years later. Both epistles give no hint that the Jewish temple had been destroyed, and its destruction, you have to remember, was a very horrific, terrible of the Jewish people. 30s or early 40s when he was one of Jesus' disciples and when he preached on the day of Pentecost after Jesus' death and resurrection. In writing 1 Peter, he would most likely have been at least in his 60s or 70s. And as I said before, Peter wrote to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who wrote to the 12 tribes which were scattered abroad. The word strangers, as used there, simply means that these individuals were exiles, or they were residing in a foreign country that was not their own real home. The real and permanent home of these believers was in heaven. These believers were strangers in a foreign country and pilgrims on a journey that one day would take them to their heavenly home. The strangers, often called the dispersion, may have been second-generation believers. The date for the writing of this epistle was about 20 years after the Jews began to disperse. References to the Gentiles in chapter 2, verses 12 and chapter 4, verse 3 may also indicate that these believers were converts after the scattering started and were perhaps sons and daughters of those that had initially been scattered. The areas of Asia Minor are listed in 1 Peter. They were under Roman rule. Some Roman emperors were very notorious for their persecution. This may have been the case for these believers here. Peter wrote to encourage them in their, as he said, manifold temptations or trials that we see in chapter 1, verse 6. Praise in 1 Peter is in chapter 5, verse 12, and he says, the true grace of God. You know, God's grace is mentioned 8 times in 1 Peter. His grace was sufficient for the heavenly home prepared for them. Suffering is mentioned over a dozen times in this short book, and this is the keynote of this epistle. The thing is, God gives grace through suffering. An outline of 1 Peter. Part 1, the salvation of the believers, is found in chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 12. So the first part is the salutation, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Part 2, salvation of the believer, chapter 1, verses 3 through 12. Broken down into part A, hope for the future, verses 3 and 4, trials for the present, verses 5 through 9, anticipation in the past, verses 10 through 11. The third part, sanctification of the believer, chapter 1, verses 13 through chapter 2, verse 12. The first part of that makes it up is, the first part, be holy, chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. Part B is love one another, chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. Part C, the third part, desire the pure milk of the word, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Part D, offer up spiritual sacrifices, chapter 2, verses 4 to 10. Part E, abstain from fleshly lusts, chapter 2, verses 11. In chapter 2, verses 13 through chapter 3, verse 12. Made up of part 1, submission to the government, chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Part 2, submission in business, chapter 2, verses 18 to 25. Part 3, submission in marriage, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Part 4, submission in all of life, chapter 3, verses 9 through 12. In the third part here, part 3, the suffering of the believer. This is seen in chapters 3, verse 13 through chapter 5, verse 14. The first part is conduct in suffering, how we are to conduct ourselves. Chapter 3, verses 13 to 17. The second part, Christ's example of suffering. Chapter 3, verses 18 through chapter 4, verse 6. Part 3, commands in suffering. Chapter 4, verses 7 through 19. And the fourth part, ministry in suffering. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. And that's made up of subsection A, talking to the elders. They are to shepherd the flock. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Subsection B, talking to the saints. They are to humble themselves. Chapter 5 and verses 5 through 9. And the fifth and final part that we see here in 1 Peter is the benediction. Chapter 5, verses 10 through 14. So we do have a verse to memorize, and that is 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7 is our memory verse, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. All right, here. All right, we're going to wrap this up here for today. I have a homework assignment for parts 10 and part 11 that we just did here on Hebrews and James and 1 Peter. So in James chapter 4, and then as we just see here in 1 Peter chapter 5, it tells us that faith produces humility. So, can you write in about 200 words or so how your faith has produced humility in your life? Is it even possible to write how humble you are? Once again, let me go over that. In James chapter 4 and in chapter 5 here in 1 Peter, it tells us that faith produces humility. Can you write in 200 words or so, can you write how your faith has produced humility in you? And is it even possible to write out how humble you are? That's your assignment for today. Well, I'll cut this short again, once again, a little bit. God bless you. We will see you next time. Thank you.